We are going to talk today about organization structure, one of my favorite topics. Uh, Basically, oh, before we get started, I did say that your discussion board on the fog of war, which is the second to last one, is due tonight, and the last one on 12 o'clock high is due the following week. So you should be working on that. And I'll give out the exam. We're almost into May. Today is the 26th of April. So I'm going to give out, I think it's the 4th. I'll send you an email firming that up, but I believe your take-home exam is on the 4th. So basically, I should start out with the discussion of organization structure with a brief comment on the gig economy, which is changing how organizations form and how they're structured. Basically, more than a third of the workforce, in 19 it was 35%, has probably gone up, have done freelance work in a given year. So because freelance work or gig work is expanding, organizations are becoming less structured. They're becoming more amorphous and flexible. And so anything I say about organizations is in flux, and the trend is away from the traditional forms of organization. Okay, let me take care of this. Hold on. All right, so as PC personal computer technology advanced in the 90s, organizations began to change. This guy, James Bryan Quinn, wrote a book in the mid 90s. I think it was around 94 or 5. And he discussed new forms of organization that were more closely approximating the way that movie companies were already by then working. You know, if you look at the history of the movie industry, when it started out in the era of silent movies, they were fixed companies, and the big studios would hire actors as permanent employees. And it was a big deal if, say, Judy Garland, the star of The Wizard of Oz, was hired by another studio. I forget which studio made The Wizard of Oz, but let's say a competitor wanted to use her for a movie. It was like a big deal, and it was the exception. So basically, they were employees, and everybody worked for the studio. It was fixed. Today, that's changed completely. The studio system is gone, and when you see a movie like 12 O'Clock High, Daryl Zanuck he produced the movie, but he was also the head of the studio, and everybody worked for Daryl Zanuck. And he decided who got hired and who didn't get hired, and who was going to star in a movie, and it was all his call. That's gradually changed so that the studios contract out to different directors who hire casts, and the cast is assembled for a given movie. And so the cast of one movie is probably not going to be repeated in the next movie the director makes. It's a gig thing, and that's closer to what companies are becoming now. And so the old ideas of organization structure are changing, and a big part of that is that organizations are basically informational communication mechanisms. They're not um, they're not just authority and control systems. They are that. If you work for a company, then you've got to do what they say, or else they'll let you go. And that's as true of the federal government as it is of entrepreneurial startup. It might be harder for the federal government to fire an employee because there are civil service rules. But in Europe, incidentally, many of you might know this already, the countries don't allow as easy firing as they do here. The employment system in the United States is based on employment at will. And the idea, I'll put that on the whiteboard, that's a very important concept. And although it's usually thought of more of it as an HR subject than organizational subject, it's highly linked to the way the US economy is going. Employment at will means that you can fire people whenever you want. So basically, if somebody goes to work for a local restaurant and the proprietor, the owner doesn't like them, they could just fire them for no reason. So they, come in, oh, I don't like that hat, goodbye. That's perfectly legal. And that contrasts sharply with the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world does not have employment at will. And a lot of people don't like it because it creates insecurity for the employees. So if you know that you can be fired at any time, you need to do what the boss says. And that's true whether you're Generation Z or a millennial, or the millennials' parents, a greatest generation, or anybody else. It's still going to be true. It's changed to some degree. There's been erosion of employment at will because of various statutory requirements, such as Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits firing on the basis of race, gender, religion, national origin, or color. But except for certain exceptions, which are siloed out of the general rule still holds. It's about 140 years old. It started in the late 19th century after the Civil War. And before that, there wasn't employment. That was not the general rule, say in the late 18th century. So sometimes people say, oh, it's old fashioned. It's, due to it's medieval or whatever. It's not medieval. The medieval rule is closer to what Europe has now, which is that you have to go through a serious process, and you can't fire people for no reason. You have to have a reason, and there needs to be a long process, and it's very difficult and expensive. And there's probably going to be a hearing, and that's why I have a friend whose niece lives in Italy, and my wife's children are in Germany, and basically it's very, very difficult to find a job. The complaints against employment at will neglect to consider the effects on employment opportunities, and that's where the gig economy comes in. If you have a highly regulated social compact where you cannot fire people easily, it becomes very, very difficult to institute a gig economy, because you can't hire for just one movie. You have to hire permanently, and either the company has to dissolve or you have to keep the people on. And the result of that is that my friend's niece and my wife's daughter were unable to find jobs until they were approaching 30 years of age. That the employment market is far more sclerotic, far more difficult to find a job because of the regulation. So what a lot of countries have done, specifically the Scandinavian countries, but across the board, is to deregulate what might be called the contingent economy, which often includes migrant workers. And so these are not covered by the social compact. And so you start to get a two-tier economy, and this has been true in a number of European countries. However, the result of that is that the country becomes more like the US economy. It becomes more flexible. And so a lot of these countries, because they have restructured their social compact to exclude sections of their workforce, are now becoming as free as the US economy. So this idea that Sweden is a socialist country is false. They've deregulated in many respects. Holland and other countries have deregulated their labor markets to a degree, and now some people can argue this results in discrimination, but that's a subject for another course. But basically, because we do have employment at will, our organizations can be restructured very easily. And this is resulting in the gig economy. And what I started to say about James Bryan Quinn is that he recognized this occurring, say, 30 years ago, but it was in response to the advent of the PC, the personal computer. You had in 1984, Apple came out with the Macintosh, and before that, the Apple I. And the Apple was probably the first usable PC. However, the whole thing started in 74 or so with the Altair. But in any case, it had evolved to a certain degree over the 10-year period, culminating with the Macintosh, which I think revolutionized many aspects of organization structure, because it made it a lot easier to computerize work. And this means that you can send emails and send nowadays, at that point not, but nowadays, texts and other forms of communication that reduce the need for an organizational structure. And to see why I claim that organizational structure is highly related to communication, and incidentally, I'm far from the first to make such a claim. It comes from Chester Barnard, the great writer of the book The Functions of the Executive. But and he was also a executive. He himself was a CEO of New Jersey Telephone, which arguably would now be called AT&T or Verizon. It used to be a monopoly, and then it broke up into different pieces. But basically, the argument that organizations are communication devices can be seen in, if you think about a military organization, or someone in my other class we were talking about what the first bureaucracy was. And bureaucracy, of course, is an important form of organization that Max von Weber named, but it existed for a long time. And it has lines of authority and a chain of command. And it also has hiring on the basis of merit, very important. And the expectation that there are qualifications for people who hold a given office. And this kind of structured, rigid organization is often attributed to the Chinese, who created a civil service as we recognize it with civil service exams, something in the area of 2,000 years ago. I'd have to check a history book to give you the exact dates, but it was roughly 2,000 years ago. And someone raised their hand and said, "Oh no, Egypt had a civil service earlier," and that could well be. You may find even going as far back as the earliest Mesopotamian civilizations that there were elements or even full-blown versions of civil service. But the Chinese had it for so long, for literally 2,000 years. It ended with the first Chinese Revolution, but basically they had it for so long that they're often credited with the invention. And so in any case, this idea that Weber called bureaucracy is an efficient form of organization. And I think the European mindset accepts that bureaucracy, by its nature, is more efficient than more older forms of organization that were more flexible. So in the 19th century, you had, let's call it, paternalistic kinds of firms that would hire and fire ad hoc without a lot of rules and regulations on them. And when I say rules and regulations, I'm talking more about self-imposed rules and regulations. There was no regulation back then. And basically, they didn't have those. They didn't have their own rules. So they would do whatever they felt like on the day. And often the power would devolve into the hands of the shift boss, and it was associated with a system of hiring called the shape up, where people would line up at the gate of the factory, and the shift boss would hire people, and it would often devolve into bribery and things like that. So basically, that kind of thing was replaced by bureaucracy, and it was a big improvement. And I think the European rules about hiring start with the assumption that your bureaucracy is somehow an optimal form of organization, but it isn't. And so, although the ad hoc forms of organization associated with 19th century laissez-faire capitalism were less efficient, and this began to be recognized in the progressive era, especially by the advocates of scientific management, and in particular Frederick Winslow Taylor and his colleagues, the Gilbreths, and there were many others. And these people realized that you can focus, if you focus on the task and redesign it in an efficient way, people can become much more productive. And I suspect it's largely because of that insight that in the 20th century, productivity growth was faster than in the 19th century, especially until 1970, when the monetary system in the United States changed. And the Bretton Woods system dispensed with the gold standard, which caused wages to stagnate. And I think productivity has slowed down since then. But basically, uh, companies then have options as to how to organize their firms. And your book in Exhibit 15-1 talks about certain organization design questions, which are questions. They're not, it's not necessarily required to do things any one way. And because of the advent of communication technology, which can easily displace organization structure as a form of organizational communication, you don't necessarily need the bureaucratic form. And in fact, most companies are doing away with it and adopting more flexible forms of organization. So basically, just to get back to what I started to say, the organization serves as a communication vehicle because because it's like a game of telephone. If we had a time in a more traditional format, we could think about maybe playing a game of telephone. So the idea is that you've got a chain of command, and one party reports to the next party, who reports to the next party, and the number of levels used to be like as many as 10 if you go back to the 1950s. But in the 80s, as the technology was advancing, the companies, and also the effect of Hertzberg's job restructuring theories. He talked about job enrichment, that you make jobs more challenging by downloading supervisory responsibilities to the employees. And the result is that you can delayer, make the work more interesting, and motivate people more by giving them more challenging jobs. But I think the real thing that was the restructuring was a combination of the globalization and the desire to be more efficient, and the recognition that so many levels weren't really necessary, in part because of the communication technology. So basically, key organization design questions include the subdivision of work, the specialization or division of labor, the recognition that there are diseconomies to the extent of specialization, just as there are diseconomies to the size of organization. I have to add that one of the beliefs of the mid-century, which had already been debunked by the 1930s by Ronald Coase, is that organizational size generates economies of scale, which make things cheaper. And that's not really true. It's true in some cases. In many cases, it's not true. The larger the firm, it could be the less efficient the firm. That's why smaller firms can often come up with ideas that defeat bigger firms. And that idea was recognized by by the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who talked about the idea of creative destruction. The idea of creative destruction is that new companies will innovate and destroy the technologies of the old. And this is essential to capitalist competition. And that is a very important insight, because traditional neoclassical economics of the kind that you study in your classes puts a lot of weight on perfect competition, which makes a lot of assumptions. But in many ways, approximates the way that markets function. However, the assumptions of perfect competition are rarely, in fact, almost never completely met. And so you can easily show that there are many disruptions to perfect competition. And especially given the regulatory environment, even in the United States now, with heavy degrees of regulation, we don't have free market systems. The claim of people that, oh, America's got a market economy and it's unfair. The US economy is so heavily regulated at this point, it's almost, you could almost say it's no longer free market. And we saw this recently with the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank. Those of you who follow the news know that there was a bailout of the Silicon Valley Bank. And we don't have time to go into it in depth, but basically what it amounted to was subsidization of the venture capital industry, because a lot of the depositors in the Silicon Valley Bank were funded by venture capital firms and did not make money. In other words, it was investor money that was deposited there, and the money was not insured by the FDIC because they simply took millions of dollars in investments and put them in SVB. So the vast majority of SVB's funds were not insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, and that's what caused the bank run. So rather than allow these firms to be punished for their miscalculation, which is how market economies work, and correctly so, because malfunctioning organizations should not be allowed to continue. Instead, the government, the public, you bailed out these wealthy venture capitalists and kept the firms going. So this is not a free market economy. It's not even close. It's socialism for the wealthy. So basically, getting back to the organization design questions, there are diseconomies of specialization, just as there are diseconomies of scale. And large firms should not be subsidized because they are inherently inefficient. If they're too big to fail, that means they're inefficient and they should fail. And if somebody says, oh, this firm's too big, it can't fail, it should be broken up. And in 08 and 09, those firms were inefficient and they should have been broken up. As far as the grouping of jobs is also a decision. How you departmentalize, how you assemble jobs and put them together also matters. As well, how you assemble the reporting relationships in the company, the chain of command, how that's put together. How many reports per manager do you have? The span of control, another word for that is span of control. Where is the decision making? Is it centralized or decentralized? In the book, Strategy and Structure, Alfred Chandler in the 1950s recognized that bigger companies were too big to manage. And so it was far more efficient to decentralize the control. And the way that was done was by setting up divisions. And the example he uses in that book is, well, he uses a number of examples. He does 4 case studies: DuPont, Sears, General Motors. One example is General Motors. And basically, the way that General Motors handled its large and growing size in the 1920s was that it took a company that had been assembled by an entrepreneur named William Durant, and the new CEO, Alfred Sloan, broke the company into 5 large divisions. Well, it's more than 5, like a number of large divisions. And in particular, he decided to break the company down by price segment. What had happened was that Willie Durant had bought Willie Durant had bought a large number of car companies. He was incompetent. He didn't manage the firms well. He was competent at buying the companies. He wasn't competent at running them. And he didn't run the firms well. And the result was that GM was losing money. There was lack of control. The employees were stealing and so on. So it went bankrupt twice. And the first time, the banks took it over, and they were running the firm and trying to decide what to do with it, while Durant went out and he founded a new car company, Chevrolet. And he used the stock. He built up Chevrolet into a large company in just a few years, and then he used the stock to buy back General Motors. So he reasserted control, and then he bankrupted it a second time a few years later. And by then, the DuPont family, which owns till to this day owns the DuPont, or what's I don't know how it worked out because DuPont's been bought and sold a few times, but until recently they held the stock of the DuPont chemical company, and probably the successor companies as well, owned a good share of General Motors. And they appointed the former CEO of DuPont Corporation, Pierre DuPont, to manage it. And he took it over, and he was trying to decide how to reorganize it. And somebody who had sold his own firm to GM, Alfred Sloan, caught his eye, and he appointed Sloan. Sloan developed a restructuring plan, and the restructuring plan was that you would organize the company by price segment. So Chevrolet was the low price car. It competed with the Model T Ford, but it competed at the higher end of the market. And he decided to put each division of GM would sell at the high end of the market. And the reason for that was that he realized, and this was a new idea that he created, that if a car ran for a few years, there were people who wanted to replace it, but there were other people who wanted to buy the used cars. And this was a new concept. And you couldn't do that with the Model T because they were very, very cheap and very, very poorly built. So Ford kind of visualized that the people who drove cars would be able to fix the cars themselves. And he in particular thought mostly farmers. He didn't think people in the cities would use them heavily, but it turned out they did. And then he realized everybody could drive a car. But the thing is, the cars were very cheap. But in today's dollars, they would have been maybe $4,000. And they weren't put together well. And what GM did was it built better cars at higher price points. And so what Sloan said was that we're going to set up 5 divisions: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. And we're going to compete in each segment at the top end of the market. We will then people will then sell the used cars that were better built and compete with the Model Ts through the used car market. So we're going to destroy Ford by selling used cars. Our used cars will be at least as good as the Model Ts. And that strategy was effective. GM became the dominant car manufacturer for a number of decades, for quite a few decades, until the 70s. So we're talking 4 decades. And then the Japanese invasion conquered GM as well as Ford. So basically, the idea of decentralization was extremely important. So in other words, what Sloan said was that we're going to download a lot of the decision making to each of the divisions so that they can make decisions. Because if you run Cadillac, you have a different set of goals than if you run Chevrolet. And the people need to treat their dealers differently. They need to treat their suppliers differently. There's different labor markets. And so you need to let the managements run their respective companies. This idea was also adopted where I worked for 3 years, Johnson and Johnson, which took this idea to a much higher degree than even GM. And part of the idea, incidentally, that Sloan considered was that there were certain responsibilities that you couldn't download. And one of these, for example, would be corporate compliance. Like you couldn't do your SEC filings by, Buick Cadillac. It had to be one GM. So there were certain corporate responsibilities. So you set up a corporate staff that was ancillary to the divisions. And the 5 car divisions weren't the only ones, because GM also made refrigerators, Frigidaire, and other things like that. And so they had multiple divisions in addition. But the idea was that you set up these divisional structures, you let the companies run their businesses, and then you appoint a side staff. And the classic one, of course, at GM was the research and development department that was headed by Kettering, who was a great inventor. He was Sloan's friend. They were good friends. And Kettering had invented many important things like the turnkey engine. Before Kettering, you had to ratchet the cars. You had to rev them up with a, turning a thing. And he invented using the key to start the engine. And he invented many other things too. And he and Sloan were friends. And when Sloan funded the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in Manhattan, he named it after both himself and Kettering. Basically, the structure that Sloan created was highly innovative. Getting back, when I worked at J&J, it's now even more so than it was then. There were 70 divisions. They called them operating companies, and they were highly decentralized. They almost had nothing to do with corporate. Corporate were the bureaucrats. So corporate, like I worked for corporate. It was like corporate benefits. I worked on the pension stuff, and there was corporate HR and corporate legal and corporate finance, and these people would oversee the company-wide issues. And one of the key insights of organizational theory is that when you have these kinds of decentralized organizations, you need to also integrate them. So these 2 guys in the 60s, Lawrence and Lorsch, studied a group of organizations, and they saw that the companies that tended to be most effective were the ones that differentiated themselves, that departmentalized, so that they could target the market most effectively. But in order to really be successful, you had to also, once you differentiated, integrate the company. So in other words, you have differentiated units, but you also need to integrate them. It's a little bit like the United States. When the United States was formed, the idea of federalism, of a decentralized system, was appealing because the states saw themselves as separate countries. And so until the Civil War, Americans referred to the country as these United States, because there were multiple states that had a lot of independence. The Civil War changed that to a large degree, but what they realized early on was that if you have one country, it also has to be integrated. You can have differentiation, but you also have a country tied together, and that's why they passed the Constitution in the early 1780s because they actually it was the late 1880s, 1780s, because they recognized that you had to integrate these diverse countries, and if you had too much differentiation, there would be conflict across the divisions. So what they did at J&J, and this fits perfectly with Lawrence and Lorsch's claims, they had these highly decentralized divisions that decided on their own marketing. They did their own research and development. For instance, when J&J invented a vaccine, it wasn't J&J that invented the vaccine. It was one of their divisions, Janssen Pharmaceutica. So they had bought this, I think it's Swiss pharmaceutical firm that an entrepreneur had founded. And they were very good at pharmaceutical research. They've been a real moneymaker for J&J. And they're the ones that invented the vaccine. So the management in the corporate office they would say, we need a vaccine, here's the funding, but they wouldn't get involved. But you see, if you have these highly diverse, so they have like a drug research firm, they have the firm that makes Band-Aids, they have the firm that made the baby powder that just had a big lawsuit that, you know, they're in trouble about, and so on. And so basically, all of these different firms are very, very different. They're health technology. They're all totally different kinds of firms that require different kinds of management. And so they don't meddle that much. However, they at the same time, they integrate these diverse firms by a few methods. One thing is what I was doing, is that they tie together the HR policies, especially regarding benefits. So if you work for J&J, you have one benefit plan. And if you move from one company to another, you will be covered by the same benefit plan. At the same time, they rotate employees. So if you spend a few years and you're successful at Johnson & Johnson products, they might move you to McNeil Labs, which makes Tylenol, or they might move you to Janssen Pharmaceutica or the birth control pill company, Ethicon, or whatever. So basically, they tie together, and then every year they have meetings of the heads of departments in given fields. So they have like a council of personnel directors, a council of finance directors. And so every year they come from all over the country to meet, all over the world, because it's truly a global firm. They come to New Brunswick and meet in a hotel that, you know, it's owned by Hyatt or somebody, and they have a meeting. So that, you know, if there's 140 divisions, they'll get 140 personnel directors, and they'll all meet each other and talk and exchange ideas and hear presentations and get to meet the CEO, and they'll all intermingle. And so they get to know each other's ideas and each other's feelings, and they also learn about the corporate focus. So through these kinds of mechanisms, and also another thing they do is for the international divisions, they have group vice presidents. And so there are people who oversee whole sections of the international operations. And so this helps them control cultural diversity and how to handle different questions that come up because of cultural diversity. So basically, they both differentiate and they integrate. And how you do that is very complex, as you can hear from what I'm saying. And there's no one right way to do it. Different organizations do these things in different ways. Now, I already talked about the federal or divisional form of organization, and that contrasts with what might be called the functional form of organization. The functional form of organization is this. I have it right on the board here. So basically, each department, you might have HR, you might have finance. Here, I'll use this thing. You might have finance, you might have manufacturing, and so on, each department representing a function. And these report to the CEO. In the federal form of organization, you do something different. Instead of having the functions report to the CEO, you have the different divisions. So at General Motors, you might have so you have the CEO, and then you have Buick here. So you might have Buick, Cadillac, etc. reporting to the CEO. And then each one of these has a marketing vice president, a finance vice president, an HR vice president. So you have multiple vice presidents reporting to the CEO. Again, the reason for that is that there's too much complexity in the market. And so to the extent that firms do this effectively, they will be better able to address the problems. Now, if a firm has a simple product, the first place I worked was International Nickel Company, and it was a big firm. They had, say, 30 or 40,000 employees, but they made a few basic commodities, nickel, copper, a couple other things. And they had huge mines where, it might have 5,000, 10,000 people working in a given mine. They had mines all over the world, but they could divisionalize a little by geography, but there was little reason for divisionalization because each mine was basically the same. So they had a mine management, and they divisionalized a bit by geographic differentiation, but otherwise it was a fairly simple operation. They didn't need a lot of divisionalization. So there are different ways to divisionalize, and these include the federal or and these include products or services. So at J&J, they differentiate by type of product. It could be geographic. Inco did that a little. So in other words, the Sudbury mine had a different management from the Indonesian mine, which had a different management from the South American mines. You could also divisionalize by processes or by types of customers. And so firms that find the right way to do it will tend to be more efficient. Firms can also decide how to create authority relations. So basically, if you have one and only one superior, that's called unity of command, and that's considered the correct way of doing things. So in other words, if you have two bosses, it happens at times, but it usually can create conflict. using a chain of command is old fashioned. It goes back to the Roman army or to the Egyptians, whatever. But basically, it's still going to exist where there's an intact organization. However, because of the gig economy, we more and more see relationships more like a star, where there's a center and everybody reports to one boss, or there's an all channel kind of relationship where everybody talks to everybody. However, the chain of command is still widely used. With respect to span of control, the trend has been fewer reports. Span of control refers to how many reports each supervisor has. If I'm a supervisor, when I was a supervisor, I was promoted to manager at City Federal Savings and Loan, and I had 8 people reporting to me, and that's an approximate right answer. However, the number has been increasing over time because of technology. So I've had students even 20 years ago who are telling me they had they worked in departments, or they themselves had 50 reports. So basically, it depends on the technology. It depends on how much intervention the boss. If you view my departmental chair as my boss, I don't know that that's accurate, but it's to a degree it is. He has, I think, 25 reports. So I think the trend has been towards more and more reports. Wider span of control means fewer levels are more current. Narrow spans, if you have narrow spans of control, there are more levels. So basically vertical communication becomes, it goes through steps. When I worked at J&J in the corporate office, there were, I think, there were 6 levels between me and the CEO. I'm not sure, something like that, 6 or 7, not important. But basically, if, let's say the CEO, and this happened, I mean, I'm not just inventing. So the CEO is on the board of IBM, and IBM has a certain stock plan, and he comes back to the company, he says, hey, IBM just adopted this plan, we should take a look at it. And he says down to the vice president, who says down to the second vice president, who says down to the comp and benefits director, who says down to the benefits director, who says down to my manager. So I was 7 levels down. And so basically, by the time that gets communicated, it kind of changes its meaning. It's like a game of telephone. And so the more levels you have, the more room for miscommunication there is. And also, I think employees feel less authority, less autonomy, and this is bad. Firms also differ by how much formalization they have. More formalization means less discretion. Low formalization means employees are free to experiment. In banks, you need a high degree of formalization because of legal requirements, and there's a lot of regulation. If you're at a tech company like Google, there's probably very little formalization. I'm sure you're held accountable for your work, but how you do things and ideas you come up with, there's a lot of openness. The idea of Foucault's bridge goes back to the author of a book called Administration in the early 20th century, is a French executive. And he came up with the idea that if you have a hierarchy, you normally have a cross communication at lower levels. So in other words, there's the term Barnard used is informal organization. Okay, that normally you have informal organizations that play as important a role in the company as the formal organization. And this means that you can't always identify I said Foucault, I meant to say Fayol. I knew I got that wrong. Fayol, Fayol. And Foucault is a different philosopher. And basically, the idea of the informal organization is that people form relationships, and so organizations are inherently political. And so boundary spanning means that you can never really understand the organization purely from the formal structure. One of the big problems with formal organization is that bureaucracy leads to problems. And in particular, it can lead to interdepartmental conflict. And very important, Robert Merton, the sociologist, noticed in the 1940s that bureaucracy leads to ritualization, and people begin to make the rules ends in themselves. And so it's useful for coordination, but it can make change difficult. You see this in government a great deal. Governments rarely abolish programs, even if they don't work. That's why free market capitalism works better, because companies can go bankrupt. And to the degree that governments prevent companies from going bankrupt, the companies become more like part of the government, and it stops being efficient. Matrix organizations are an alternative. So I've been talking about decentralized versus centralized kinds of organizations. But matrix organizations create a dual chain of command. So what you basically have is you have both functional and, say, product oriented or other oriented responsibility. So you have like the functions: finance, marketing, personnel, or HR, manufacturing, is one set of reporting relationships. My computer doesn't like this thing. And then you also have at the same time product organizations. So you have like product team 1, product team 2, product team 3, and all of these people equally report to these different functions. So you basically have 2 bosses, which violates what I just said about unity of command. But it does have the advantage that you can focus on given targets. So basically, you could have, for example, in a business college, reporting via your functional department, like you're in the management department, and also via the program. So you have undergrad, master's, PhD, and so you have 2 reporting relationships. And the reason that can work is that the reporting relationships concern different issues. So there's not a lot of interference. Now, another approach are virtual organization structures. And these are becoming more prevalent and more common in the gig economy. And so in a virtual, and this goes back to James Bryan Quinn in the 90s, this was already occurring. So in the virtual, or actually, it goes back a lot further, because you had this going on even back in the 1920s. Alfred Sloan invented the automobile car franchise, the car dealers. And you had in the 50s, you had McDonald's, and franchising goes back to actually invented by Benjamin Franklin in the 18th century. So, it goes back a long time. But it's because things like this are becoming more prevalent. So basically, more flexible organization means that more diverse talent can be quickly assembled and dismissed. So some examples are franchises, hollowed organizations where non-critical functions are outsourced, and critical ones like design are insourced. Modular forms of organization where key product components are outsourced. Cross-functional teams where independent teams are given resources and assigned different market opportunities. You could also use the image of a circular organization where, and this is kind of like what I was talking about with the STAR organization, where the CEO is at the center and lower ranking assistants at the outer rings. And organizations re-image the traditional pyramid by flattening it and making it more equal. The trend has been, in the 80s and 90s, there was a great deal of downsizing and leaner organizations. There was a systemic effort to make organizations smaller by closing locations, reducing staff. This involved delayering. And the downsizing reduced bureaucracy and speeded decision-making. So this is all stuff that's occurred in my lifetime, and I saw it happen in the 80s and 90s. The trend has been away from the mechanistic bureaucracies towards more organic structures. And the difference is that a mechanistic model is a structure characterized by extensive departmentalization, high formalization, limited information networks, and centralization, whereas an organic model is a structure that is flat, uses cross-hierarchical and cross-functional teams, has low formalization, and produces relies on participative decision-making. So basically, the trend has been away from high formalization towards flexibility, interchange of information, more flexibility. Fayose Bridge is becoming the rule rather than the exception. The idea that structure follows strategy comes from Alfred Chandler. He recognized it in his classic book, which I highly recommend. It's a very interesting read, even though it's old. Basically, innovation or the differentiation is matched by an organic structure. So if you have an innovative strategy, you're better off, and Google would be an example, you're better off with less structure, low specialization, low formalization, and decentralization. If you have a cost minimizing strategy, you need tight control and high centralization to keep costs low. If you are an imitator, which in a famous book by these two guys, Miles and Snow, is called an analyzer, then you need a mix of tight and loose properties, tight controls over current activities and looser controls for new undertakings. Big size obviously leads to formalization. If you have a company of at least 50 people, you need some bureaucracy. You need some departmentalization. These things adapt to technology, and technology changes. I started out by saying that. Environmental factors include the complexity of the environment, how volatile it is, the capacity, how the environment can support growth, and this will affect organization structure too. A final issue I'll talk about before I take attendance is organizational culture, which we will talk about next time. Institutions are cultural in nature. The very word institution can be defined as a pattern of habit. And a pattern of habit is related to the collective mental programming that organizational culture reflects. So basically, organizations and institutions are long-standing patterns of behavior. And one of the ways of looking at how organizations function is to say that they copy each other, that their institutions by nature copy each other. And the result may be that many are not efficient and don't have adaptive characteristics. So the result of that is that we can't just assume that because something is a bureaucracy that it's efficient, or that because it's a company that exists, it's the best way of doing things. And if you get locked into history, what you do if you excessively rely on existing organizations, your country will gradually go into decline. The great historian, Sir Arnold Toynbee, in his book, A Study of History, and I read the abridged version. The original version is 10 volumes. The abridged version is a mere 650 pages. And if you read that, you come to the point where Toynbee says one of the characteristics, he goes through, like, I think he tried to describe every civilization he could identify. And one of the things he comes to, one of the patterns, and the point of the book is to see why civilizations rise and fall. And one of the patterns is that rising civilizations imitate other civilizations. So like China is copying our technology, say, that's a rising civilization. Dying civilizations copy their own histories. So if a country says we don't do that, it's not traditional, or a company does that, then they are a dying organization or a dying country. Whereas if a company or a country imitates others and learns from others, then they are a growing economy. And that means that markets largely drive success. Okay, so we'll talk more about organizational culture next time. And I would say culture is fundamental to understanding why an organization can succeed or fail. And a lot of what happens to companies is the direct outcome of their culture, their patterns of behavior. Okay, so today we will take attendance now at the end of the class. And when I call your name, please let me know, and you will be free. The class will end with attendance, so feel free to leave when you hear me call you. If you want to talk about something, feel free to stay. Syed Abbas.
Here, Professor.
Hello. Syed Ahmad.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello. Samima Akhtar.
Here, Professor.
Hello. Alessandro Alessi.
I'm here.
Hello. David Batesh. David. Okay. Anam Bahati.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Anam. Melissa Calixto.
Good morning.
Morning. Winston Chan.
Here, Professor.
Hello, sir. Bin Chen. Bin. Kai Chen.
Here.
Hello, Kai. Jirui Deng.
I'm here.
Hello. Farhan Aram.
Here, Professor.
Hello. Brianna Faustin. Steve Finn.
Here.
Hello. Jonathan Gonzalez.
Here.
Hello. June Grant.
Here.
Hello. Minghao Hu.
Here.
Hello. Angelica Laborde. Jian Lin.
Here.
Hello. Leon Liu.
Here, Professor. Good morning.
Good morning, Leon. Elizabeth Maddox.
Good morning.
Hello, Elizabeth. Demi, I'm sorry, Rochelle Mendez. Rochelle Mendez.
Here.
Hello.
Here.
Hello. Demi Mullings.
I'm here.
Hello, Demi. Cameron.
I'm here.
Hello. Nicholas Neglia.
Here.
Hello. Aquino Olivier. Aquino. Jenny Perfecto.
Here.
Hello, Jenny. Chenille Powell.
Here.
Hello. Winjin Turabov.
Hello, Professor.
Hey, Winjin. I left out Anna Siddiqui.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Jaron Walls. Yi Wen Wu. Yi Wen. Kristen Yip.
Here, Professor. See you next class.
See you next time, Kristen. Anita Zhao.
Here.
Hello. Okay, I'm going to call the people I haven't called yet. If you're here, let me know. David. Vitesh. Bin Chen.
I'm here.
Bin, okay. Brianna Faustin. Minhao Hu.
I'm here, Professor.
Okay, Minhao, got it. Kino Olivier. Jaron Walls. Yi Wen Wu. Okay, and that's it. All right, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, class is over.
I have one question. Will there be a review before the take home or no?
Yeah, I'll try to fit in a little bit. That's a good point. I'll try to do it. I did post my lecture notes in Blackboard, and you can look those over if you need a quick mind refresher. But I think the best way to study for the book, to study for the exam, is to read the book. Okay, read it, try to read it very rigorously, and you should do well.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, anyone else? Questions? Okay.